The prairie stretched endlessly, the tall grass swaying gently in the wind as Margaret Peterson settled on her porch. She was 78 years old and had been confined to a wheelchair for 20 years. Her hands rested folded in her lap as her gaze wandered over the land that had once been her home and playground. In her youth, she had ridden horses as if she were one with them. But a car accident had changed everything, and her connection to these majestic creatures was now limited to observing them from afar. That morning, something was different. A dark Mustang stood at the edge of her property, still and watchful. Its muscular frame stood out against the horizon, its glossy coat catching the light of the rising sun. Margaret held her breath. Wild horses never came this close to human dwellings, yet there he was, watching her with intelligent, curious eyes. She felt her heart race. Carefully, she raised a hand, as if to signal that she posed no threat. The Mustang twitched its ears but remained standing. A silent bond seemed to form between them. Then, as unexpectedly as he had appeared, he turned and disappeared into the tall grass. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Margaret sat motionless for a long time, her gaze fixed on the spot where the horse had stood. An unexpected hope stirred within her. Perhaps this was no coincidence. Perhaps this Mustang had come to her for a reason. When her granddaughter Emma visited later that day, Margaret told her about the encounter. "A wild horse came up to me, Emma. So close, I could almost touch it." Emma smiled and shook her head. "Grandma, maybe you imagined it. Wild Mustangs are shy." But Margaret knew it had been real, and deep inside she felt it wasn't the last time she would see the Mustang. The next morning, Margaret was outside earlier than usual. Her eyes scanned the horizon, hoping the Mustang would return. Hours passed, but nothing happened. Just as she was about to give up, she heard the soft crunch of hooves on dry grass. There he was again. This time he came even closer. Margaret barely dared to breathe. His dark eyes studied her intently as he cautiously took a few steps closer. Without thinking, Margaret reached out her hand. "Hey there," she whispered softly. The Mustang twitched its ears as if understanding her. Then slowly, he lowered his head, his nostrils flaring as he took in her scent. An incredible moment of connection hung in the air, and this time, he didn't run away. From that day on, the Mustang returned every morning. Margaret named him Shadow, a fitting name for a creature that moved silently through the plains, elusive yet always seeming to be near. She began setting out small buckets of water for him and spoke to him in the gentle voice she had once used for her own horses. Emma remained skeptical. "Grandma, wild horses aren't easily tamed. Be careful, okay?" But Margaret was sure. Shadow wasn't just a wild animal. He was seeking something, perhaps companionship, perhaps a home, and Margaret felt that her own story with him had only just begun. The days passed, and Shadow came more frequently. He grew accustomed to Margaret's presence, and over time she even dared to leave small treats like carrots for him. At first hesitant, he eventually accepted the food and stayed longer in her presence. Margaret felt more alive than she had in years. The Mustang's companionship gave her a sense of peace she had long thought lost. But not everyone in the small town viewed Shadow's presence so favorably. Tom, a rancher who had worked with horses all his life, warned Margaret one afternoon. "Wild Mustangs can be dangerous. If he gets too comfortable around you, it could cause problems." Margaret remained calm. "He's just seeking a connection, like I am." Tom shook his head. "I just hope you know what you're doing." Margaret knew, but what she didn't know was that Shadow's presence hadn't gone unnoticed, and there were people who didn't want to see a wild animal finding its place beside an old woman. Margaret woke early. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains of her small house. It had become a fixed part of her days to roll onto the porch and look out for Shadow. The plains shimmered golden in the soft sunlight, and the wind carried the scent of damp grass and earth. But today everything was still. No soft hooves, no dark shadow moving at the edge of her property. Shadow wasn't there. A sinking feeling rose within her. In the past weeks he had appeared every morning. She had begun to understand his habits, how he approached the house, first cautiously, then with growing trust. She had even dared to call him in a soft voice, and each time He had turned his ears toward her. But today was different. Margaret waited for minutes, then hours. Shadow didn't appear. A lump formed in her throat as she wondered what could have happened. Had he decided to move on? Or had something happened to him? The plains were full of dangers, coyotes, storms, and worse. There were those who saw mustangs as nuisances. Emma came by in the afternoon and found her grandmother sitting on the porch with a worried expression. "What's wrong?" she asked, concerned. "He didn't come," Margaret replied quietly. Emma frowned. "Maybe he's just somewhere else. Wild animals have their own ways." But Margaret wasn't sure. Something felt wrong. That night she could hardly sleep. She tossed and turned in her bed as the wind howled around the house. Around midnight, she finally got up, wrapped herself in a blanket, and rolled onto the porch. The darkness lay heavy over the plains. Only the distant call of an owl broke the silence. And then a sound. Hoofbeats, faint but unmistakable. Her heart raced as she squinted, trying to make out shapes in the darkness. And then she saw him. Shadow was slowly approaching the house, but something was different. His gait was heavy, as if each step took effort. As he stepped into the moonlight, Margaret froze. His right foreleg was bleeding. "Oh, my boy," she whispered. She didn't know what had happened, but Shadow was hurt. Without thinking, she rolled as close to him as she could. "It's okay, Shadow. I'm here." The Mustang stopped, his breath heavy, his flanks rising and falling rapidly. Margaret knew she had to do something, but she was alone. There was only one person who could help her. Tom, the rancher. He wouldn't be happy to help, she knew, but he understood horses, and that was all that mattered now. So Margaret made a decision. She would ask him for help, and she would do whatever it took to save Shadow. The next morning, Margaret was determined. She pulled on a jacket and slowly rolled down the dusty road, leading to the nearby ranch. Tom was repairing a fence when he saw her and narrowed his eyes suspiciously. "Margaret, what brings you here?" he asked, leaning on his tool. "Tom, I need your help," she began without preamble. "Shadow is hurt. He came back to me last night. His leg is bleeding." Tom sighed heavily and shook his head. "I told you that Mustang would bring trouble. He shouldn't be so close to people." Margaret lifted her chin. "I'm not asking for a lecture, Tom. I'm asking for help. You know horses. You know what to do." Tom studied her for a moment, then took a deep breath. "Show me the horse." Together they returned to the house. Shadow was still nearby, barely putting weight on his injured leg. Tom approached him carefully, his years of experience with horses evident in his calm movements. "That looks bad," he muttered, "but he can recover if we treat it right." He turned to Margaret. "I can apply some salve and bandage the wound, but he needs rest. And you need to understand, Margaret, if he becomes too tame, they won't consider him a wild animal anymore." Margaret nodded. She knew she was walking a fine line, but she was willing to do whatever it took to help Shadow. Tom carefully tended to the Mustang's injured leg, and for the first time in a long while, Margaret felt something like hope. Maybe, just maybe, everything would be all right. The days following Shadow's injury were a mix of worry and hope for Margaret. Tom came by each morning to tend to the Mustang's wound, and to Margaret's relief, the treatment was working. Shadow began putting more weight on his leg, though still cautiously. It was a small but significant improvement, but the growing bond between Margaret and Shadow didn't go unnoticed in town. Some neighbors had started talking about the wild Mustang that kept showing up near the old woman's house. Margaret knew it was only a matter of time before someone intervened. One afternoon, as she watched Shadow grazing nearby, she heard the sound of a car on the gravel road. She turned and saw a Jeep with the logo of the local wildlife agency. Two men got out and approached her. "Miss Peterson," one of them said, "we've received reports of a wild Mustang frequenting this area near human habitation. Can we ask you a few questions?" Margaret felt her stomach tighten. "Of course," she said calmly. The man, who introduced himself as Ranger Collins, pulled out a notebook. "We've been told you've had regular contact with a Mustang. Is that correct?" Margaret nodded. "Shadow comes here often. He's no trouble. I take care of him." Collins exchanged a glance with his colleague. "Wild Mustangs belong in nature, Miss Peterson." If they get too comfortable around people, they lose their instincts. That can be dangerous for them. Margaret straightened her shoulders. He's not looking for handouts. He was hurt, and I helped him. What's wrong with that? The second ranger, a younger man, chimed in. We need to ensure he doesn't stay here permanently. There are rules to protect these animals. Rules that might endanger him more than help him, Margaret shot back sharply. Collins sighed. We'll keep an eye on the situation, but if he stays here, we'll have to take action. With a nod, the rangers left, and Margaret watched them go, her heart heavy. She knew Shadow's time by her side was limited. That evening, Emma came by and found her grandmother unusually quiet. Grandma, what's wrong? She asked worriedly. Margaret sighed. The Wildlife Agency was here. They're watching Shadow. If they think he's not wild enough, they'll take him away. Emma bit her lip. Then we need to make a plan. Margaret nodded. She knew they didn't have much time. They had to find a solution before it was too late. In the following days, the mood in town shifted. Tom the rancher came by again, this time with a warning. Margaret, I know this Mustang means something to you, but if the agency gets involved, there's nothing you can do. They'll take him if they think it's necessary. I won't let them take him, Margaret said firmly. He's not a nuisance, Tom. He belongs here. Tom looked at her for a long moment, then slowly shook his head. You're going to have to fight, Margaret, and it won't be easy. Margaret knew he was right, but she wasn't ready to give up on Shadow. She spent every spare moment with him, speaking softly to him and preparing herself for the day she would have to stand up for him. Meanwhile, Emma had been in touch with an organization dedicated to protecting wild horses. They had promised to monitor Shadow's situation and support Margaret if the Wildlife Agency tried to capture him. The knowledge that she wasn't alone gave Margaret renewed strength. One morning, as she sat with Shadow in the pasture, she heard the sound of a car again. This time, the rangers weren't alone. They had a trailer with them. Margaret's heart raced. The moment had come. Miss Peterson, we need to take the animal in, Colin said without preamble. He's had too much contact with humans. Margaret clenched her fists. He belongs here. He lives in the wild. He's not a pet to be rounded up. Colin sighed. This isn't your decision. We have our orders. Margaret took a deep breath, then did something no one expected. She rolled her wheelchair directly in front of the trailer and crossed her arms. If you want to take him, you'll have to go through me first. The rangers looked uncertain. Tom, who had also arrived by now, stepped up beside Margaret. Are you sure you want to do this? He asked quietly. Yes, Margaret said firmly. I'll fight for him. Tom looked at the situation, then nodded slowly. Then I will too. Emma, standing behind them, pulled out her phone. I'll call the press. If you do this, everyone will know what's happening here. Colin sighed heavily. He clearly hadn't expected so much resistance. Let's discuss this, he muttered finally, and he and his colleague retreated to their vehicle. Margaret knew the fight wasn't over, but she had won the first round, and she was determined to keep fighting for Shadow no matter the cost. Margaret sat on her porch, watching Shadow grazing in the distance. She knew the Wildlife Agency wouldn't give up so easily. The encounter with the rangers had only delayed things, not stopped them. If she wanted to protect Shadow, she needed a permanent solution. Emma had already spoken with various organizations, but most could do little. Mustangs were protected by strict laws, and once one was deemed problematic, it was hard to secure its freedom. Margaret knew Shadow couldn't simply be taken to a holding facility. He wouldn't survive there. The days passed and Margaret grew restless. Tom came by regularly, helping her devise a plan. We need support, Margaret, he said one afternoon. If enough people speak out, they can't just take him. Margaret nodded. We need to rally the community. Everyone here knows what Shadow means to me. Emma sat down at the computer and started a petition. She contacted local newspapers and animal lovers. Within days, news of Margaret's fight spread throughout the town. People came by to show their support, but the Wildlife Agency remained stubborn. One morning before sunrise, Margaret was awakened by the sound of a truck engine. She hurried to the porch and saw several rangers stepping out of their vehicles. They had a horse trailer with them. Miss Peterson, Colin said calmly, we've been ordered to take the Mustang in. Margaret crossed her arms. "And I have no intention of letting you." Tom, Emma, and several neighbors quickly gathered, forming a human barrier between Shadow and the Rangers. "We stand with Margaret," someone shouted. Collins sighed. "We don't want a conflict, but we have to take the animal. He doesn't belong here." "He does," Margaret said firmly. "He's not harming anyone." "The decision has been made," Collins replied. "Please step aside." Margaret hesitated for only a second. "Then you'll have to move me first." The tension grew. No one knew what would happen next. Then Tom stepped forward. "You see that no one here wants Shadow to go. Maybe you should reconsider your decision." The Rangers retreated to confer. The minutes dragged by painfully slowly as the supporters waited in tense silence. Finally, Collins and his team returned. "We'll review this case again," Collins said reluctantly. "But that doesn't mean the Mustang can stay here." Margaret breathed a sigh of relief. She had bought Shadow more time, perhaps enough to find a long-term solution. A few days later, Margaret received an unexpected call. A major Mustang protection organization had heard about her story and offered to take Shadow to a sanctuary where he could live freely. Margaret knew it was the best chance to save him. With a heavy heart, she agreed. On the day of the farewell, Emma, Tom, and many neighbors stood by her side. Margaret approached Shadow, placed a hand on his warm forehead, and whispered, "Live free, my boy." The Mustang looked at her with his deep, understanding eyes before slowly stepping into the trailer. Margaret knew she would never see him again, but she had fought for him and won. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Thanks to our valued viewers, we continue to improve every day. Please subscribe and give this video a thumbs up.